He's an associate professor at Kalamazoo College, which is a lot harder to say than it looks. Welcome to Gospel Tangents, the best source for Mormon history, science, and theology. I'm Rick Bennett. Phyllis Schlafly was an important figure in defeating the Equal Rights Amendment of the 1970s. In our next conversation with Dr. Petry, we're going to talk more about Phyllis and how she helped persuade LDS leaders to oppose the Equal Rights Amendment and feminism in general. We'll also talk about how rhetoric has changed about feminism in the LDS Church. Check out our conversation. I also want to remind you that if you'd like a copy of Taylor's book, Tabernacles of Clay, sign up for our free contest here at gospeltangents.com/Petrey. That's Petrey, and you could win this book right here. So sign up today.
I think this is a kind of a good way to kind of segue into chapter 2, which deals with feminism. And so, I'm probably old enough to barely remember Phyllis Schlafly. But I think a lot of my listeners are going to be like, "Now, who's that?" But she was a very important figure. And so, can you introduce us to who is Phyllis Schlafly and why is she important?
Yeah. If people haven't watched Mrs. America on Hulu, have you seen this yet? By the way,
I don't have Hulu, so no, I haven't seen it.
You got to get Hulu. Anyway, it's one of the best shows. It's got an amazing cast, and Phyllis Schlafly is the central character of this story, and it tells the story. The book kind of gets into this a little bit too, but you've got feminism, which is of course on the rise in the 60s and 70s. And as often happens, there become then counter movements to oppose those things. And Phyllis Schlafly becomes the most famous anti-feminist during this time period. Schlafly is a Catholic, and she sort of sees something that had been happening in the broader conservative religious world at the time, where there had been a backlash to the kinds of feminism that was arising, but it hadn't really been organized as a political movement. So she sees that evangelicals and Protestant fundamentalists and even Mormons, are opposing feminism. And she says we need to unite all of these people into a single coalition that will sort of be able to speak for our values. And the big issue of the time period is the Equal Rights Amendment. And the Equal Rights Amendment was hugely popular among Democrats and Republicans. All the Republicans at the outset of it passing in Congress were ecstatic about it, and then it needs to sort of march through the states, and immediately I think it's passed by the first 32 states, like within the first year or something like that, and then that's when the opposition really gets going, when the Stop ERA movement that Phyllis Schlafly is organizing and pulling together all these sort of anti-feminist groups into a political coalition, and the church gets involved, is specifically recruited by Phyllis Schlafly to get involved in this fight, and politically mobilizes for the first time in decades. At that point, the church had not really seen itself as having a political mission. Even during the ERA at the very beginning, if you asked church leaders in the first couple of years that the ERA was a public topic in the early 70s. The ERA had been around since the 1920s, but it really kind of gets going in the early 70s. It was supposed to be the sort of follow-up to the civil rights amendments or civil rights movements of the 1960s, and so now is the feminists' turn, right? And so the church gets recruited to do this and reverses itself, because at first it was saying, no, this is a political issue. We don't comment on political issues. We just care about moral issues, not political ones. But Schlafly convinces the church that this is a moral issue, that it's not just a political issue, and so the church decides to mobilize its membership in this political fight, and they start sending members to ERA conventions to shout down the leaders there and to sort of disrupt the meetings. And the church's nearly decade-long, it lasted about 8 years, fight against the Equal Rights Amendment until it was finally defeated in 1982 decisively, was one of the major ways that the church kind of gets involved in the anti-feminist movement. So yeah, that's the basic history of who Schlafly is and how she kind of gets the church involved in this.
Well, and it was interesting to me to hear how she recruited LDS members. because it seems like she went first to the General Relief Society president, and then that kind of morphed into President Kimball. And so, could you give us a few more details on that? Because that was really surprising to me. I didn't know any of that history. That was awesome.
Yeah. Yeah. So she secures a meeting with Barbara B. Smith, who was brand new in her role as Relief Society president, and had just taken over from Eloise Bell, I think is who it was before. I might be misremembering that, but who had been the Relief Society president for over 20 years, was a very well-known, popular figure, a nationally known figure in some cases, because she was involved in a number of national women's organizations. And so Barbara B. Smith sort of, I think she had just been in the job a few months when she takes this meeting with Schlafly, and then Smith takes it to the male general authorities, to the apostles, and they say, maybe this is a good idea, and they organize a meeting for her to come out and speak publicly, because the politics of having women oppose the Equal Rights Amendment were very powerful. That's why Schlafly was so successful. If men were out there opposing the Equal Rights Amendment, it just looked like old-fashioned patriarchy. But if you get women involved in anti-feminism, then it's going to be much more successful. So they initially have Barbara B. Smith as sort of being the public face of the church's opposition. But soon the male church leaders really kind of take the lead after that, and start to call the shots and run a whole political playbook and so on. And it's a political playbook that works really, really well. It's extremely effective, and it gets a lot of attention from Schlafly, from the other members of the religious right, and it's one that they then use in later political battles, of course, against same-sex marriage as well. They have a whole set of sort of tools and strategies, and many of the people who were running the opposition to the Equal Rights Amendment, including Hinckley, Monson, these guys then become, of course, the leaders of the church's opposition to same-sex marriage in the 1990s and 2000s. And they are running some of the same plays that they used then as well. So they learned a lot from it in terms of having a successful campaign. And if you look at it, they were very successful. They defeated the ERA, and it's not looking like it's going to come back. I mean, there are some rumblings every once in a while it's going to come back, right? So you can see why they thought this was a wildly successful. We won not only the political, but also the cultural battle against it, and it's not coming back. And so when they finally do get to same-sex marriage, I'm jumping ahead a little bit here, right? But just trying to play this out. When they do get to same-sex marriage, they think, we can be just as successful, if not more, on this as we were in opposing feminism. And that turns out to be a miscalculation, right? Anyway, yeah, that's a little bit of the how they get involved in this issue, and how they change from being sort of just preaching anti-feminist values, in favor of the patriarchal order, to then making it a whole political strategy too.
Well, and it was interesting also to see how the church changed from this kind of patriarchal order of marriage into more of an egalitarian. And it's almost as if they adopted a lot of the ERA words and things. And so, but yet they were still anti-feminist. Yeah. Can you talk about how that evolved, that change in rhetoric in the LDS leaders?
Yeah, so I try to chart a split in the way that church leaders start to think about feminist issues in their opposition to the Equal Rights Amendment. And while we only really heard the patriarchal order in the 50s and 60s, when we get to the 70s and definitely in the 80s, we start to see certainly the patriarchal order continues. There are a number of strong proponents of the patriarchal order, but we start to see another branch of LDS thought developing. It's, of course, we're finding it in LDS feminists from this time period as well, but we're definitely even seeing it among general authorities who are taking a much more softer stance on the patriarchal order and are much more open to egalitarian marriage, which was the sort of ideal of marriage that many feminists and certainly Mormon feminists were advocating. The idea that male and female, the husband and wife, are equal partners in the relationship. And so we see this kind of split, this tension between the two. Kimball on the one hand, and Benson, certainly. Benson is probably the most famous example of the sort of patriarchal order that lasts up through the 80s. While you've got Barbara Smith and Hinckley and a few others who are trying to take a little bit softer, more accommodationist stance, who want to say, we don't oppose equal rights for women. We don't oppose the equality between men and women. We actually support it. We just don't think that the Equal Rights Amendment is the best way to do that, right? So they want to like support the cause, but not support the specific policy, right? While others don't want to support the cause or the policy at all. So you see a kind of new way of thinking about relationships as possibly egalitarian, and that egalitarian relationships may be compatible with Mormon teachings emerging in this time period. And of course, today, I think egalitarianism is pretty much the dominant strain within marriage, right? It's pretty much the dominant strain, the way that we think about it. But even if you look at something like the Proclamation on the Family that comes about in 1995, you see the ways in which that reflects that internal tension between egalitarianism on the one hand, because it has husband and wife are equal partners, right? And then also at the same time, you have the patriarchal language of the husband presides, right? How can you have husband presides and that they're equal partners? That doesn't make any sense, right? But we have this tension then that sort of is these two different streams of the way that the church is thinking about its teachings to widen itself in such a way to be able to accommodate both, so that both sides of this issue can be happy. And it sort of helps to diffuse some of the feminist critiques that were happening. Of course, question of priesthood and the question of church leadership is a separate one, right? So I'm confining myself here to the question of marriage itself, but at least in that sphere, they tend to be much more accommodating and open to new kinds of relationships. Of course, also because that's what church members were doing. Church members were having egalitarian relationships, and sort of, young women who had grown up in a feminist era, even if they weren't feminists, just expected like sort of different kinds of freedoms than their mothers may have had, and different kinds of opportunities than their mothers may have had. So, part of the reason I think we also seeing the shift in church teachings is because that's how members are actually practicing it at that point too.
Yeah, well, and kind of the other interesting thing I think about ERA is they were worried about how that would affect lesbians, and also how birth control was kind of a big issue about whether you should even use it. And so, can you talk a little bit about how the church kind of evolved with birth control, especially? Because that was an interesting movement.
Let me talk about the ERA and same-sex attraction and homosexuality. So, because I think that one of the things that many people miss, they see that as an anti-feminist action, right? But what the church is doing in its opposition to the Equal Rights Amendment is that they're very explicitly linking feminism to homosexuality. And they even say in the documents that they're distributing to church members, that that this is going to lead to same-sex marriages, and even worse, same-sex couples might be raising children, right? And freaking out about that. Right. And then they are saying things like, if a woman goes to work and even dresses like a man, at this point they're still worried about women wearing pants instead of skirts, right? Like that's where they're at. Then they're going to become mannish in their desires, and they're going to be attracted to women, right? It's not quite how it works, actually, but that's really what they're thinking, is that if you behave and if you act like a man, then you're going to desire women. And that's where we get lesbians. That's how lesbians come about, right? So they're linking, and they're seeing sort of women's liberation and homosexuality as joint issues, and that in order to fight one, you have to fight the other, right? So they see them as linked, which again is why I think some of the histories that have come up before this that don't connect LGBT history in the church and anti-feminist history in the church have fully grasped the way that the church leaders at least saw those as integrated. The question of birth control is an interesting one. Because there was really almost no accommodation to birth control. The church was very strongly opposed to it. They saw it as one of what they called an unholy and impure practice. They warned that people were going to be, denied celestial blessings if they ever practiced birth control. And that, I think, included even, what we would call natural methods. They didn't want anything that that limited output in any way. There were people who were pushing back against this even in the 60s. So Hugh B. Brown, the sort of liberal member of the first presidency, was a little more thought that couples should be able to make their own decisions. So we have some opposition to the anti-birth control movement within the church, but the dominant form in the church up until the 1980s had been really to discourage it, highly discourage it. And then we get a policy change in 1983 that says it's up to the couple, and we're not going to pry about it, and you guys just make your own decisions, But this was a huge controversy in the church. It was in again, broader society as well. In the 1960s, you have the introduction of the pill as the first kind of widely publicly available form of birth control. And it was hugely popular as a result, right? It's one of the things that helps to fuel the sexual revolution of the 1960s and 70s. And that's part of the reason why church leaders were also really skeptical of it. Again, they connected birth control and illicit sex as, one leads to the other, right? So
and leads to the ERA as well, right?
Yeah, exactly. So but church members are often, not always, but are often just ignoring those teachings, and so I think that's another reason why we see the church leadership sort of change its policies from what we would call a sort of procreationist or pronatalist sexual ethics, right? The purpose of sex was for reproduction. That's the way that church leaders thought about it. But you get in the 70s and then in the 80s a kind of softening of that where they say, well, that's one of the purposes, but another purpose is spousal bonding, happiness, enjoyment, and those kinds of things, right? And so they start to sort of acknowledge that that's not the exclusive purpose for sexual intimacy between couples, and they relax the teachings on birth control. And with that comes a total change in the way that we think about sexuality in the church. Once sex isn't just exclusively for reproduction, it takes on all of these other meanings. And so there is really kind of a mini sexual revolution in the church during this time period as a result.
I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Dr. Taylor Petry. In our next conversation, we'll talk about Elder Oak's role in designing LGBT policy for church leaders since his calling as an apostle in 1984.
But he anticipates that this is going to be the thing. And the reason why is because same-sex marriage had been on the agenda in the 70s and 80s among gay rights activists as well. So again, it wasn't invented in the 1990s. It wasn't invented in the 2000s. People were talking about this back in the 60s and 70s and definitely in the 80s. And Oak sort of sees, like, if we're going to get involved in opposing gay rights, we need to maintain some credibility on this issue and save it for gay marriage. That's the one thing that we really need to care about, because if gay marriage is legalized, then it becomes socially normal to such an extent that we won't be able to teach against it anymore. And so he really sort of anticipates exactly where we are today, that
is it prophetic?
Probably, he would see so, I'm sure.
If you'd like to hear the entire interview uncut, please subscribe to patreon.com/gospeltangents. And for just $5 a month, you can hear the entire interview without any interruption. If you'd like a paperback version of our transcripts, go to Amazon.com and do a search for Gospel Tangents interview. Also, if you'd like to give the money to me and not Amazon, please subscribe on my website, and I'll be able to send you a transcript as soon as they are completed, and click the subscribe button. You can also find our latest information on Facebook.com/GospelTangents, as well as we're on Twitter @GospelTangents. And don't forget to subscribe on Apple Podcasts. The link is at tinyurl.com/gospeltangents, and you can subscribe there. Also, please give us a 5-star review. If you want to support all of the podcasts as part of the Dialogue Podcast Network, go to lyceum.fm, that's lyceum.fm, and do a search for Dialogue Podcast Network or Gospel Tangents, because, that's a pretty cool one too. Thanks again for listening. Click here to subscribe, here for a transcript, and over here we've got some of our great videos. Thanks again.